the White Cliffs of Dover, the first site visitors have had to Kent for thousands of years. The Romans would have seen it. In fact, the Romans brought this with them, this wild cabbage which they introduced about 100 AD. But Kent isn't just full of the busiest port in the world and 2 motorways and 1.5 million people. Kent's also got the most extraordinary diversity and range of wildlife, from the White Cliffs of Dover here to the chalk downlands up on the North Downs, to the River Stour, the River Medway, the wetlands of Stodmarsh, the estuaries of the North Kent marshes, the old ancient woodlands of the Weald and the ringwoods around Canterbury. A fantastic range of wildlife. We want you to explore this wildlife with us over the next 40 minutes of this video. I was amazed the first time I saw these kittiwakes here at Dover. I associate this elegant small gull with the west coast of Scotland and other wild places, but here it is, right next to the port of Dover, doing just fine. The peregrine falcon's doing well too. They returned to the cliffs of Dover to breed after an absence of more than 40 years. Since 1990, one pair has regularly reared 2 or 3, and in 1 year even 4 young. Peregrines are wonderful to watch, with a fast and dramatic flight as they search for their prey. The peregrine's eye view from the top of the cliffs is spectacular right across to France, and with plants like this sea stock flowering colourfully right on top of the chalk cliffs. The kittiwakes wheeling far below are joined by the larger herring gull. They'll take almost anything, live or dead fish, marine worms, bits of unsavoury rubbish. This one's got a crab. It's always worth looking inland on the Dover cliffs as well as out to sea. There seems to be a whitethroat singing its scratchy song from the top of almost every bush. The sheer depth of chalk at Dover has to be seen to be believed, and this is, if you like, the bottom of the spine, the coccyx of the long backbone of chalk that runs right the way up the North Downs towards London. It's the very heart of Kent. Here at Liddon Down, about 5 miles north of Dover, the chalk outcrops to form chalk grassland, one of the great botanical and insect habitats of the whole county. There are spectacular views too, with the chalk shining whitely through the colourful sward. And from the top of the downs, it seems as if you can see forever. About 35 million years ago, Kent would have been underwater in a shallow tropical sea. And millions of tiny creatures would have died and dropped to the bottom of that sea and formed this stuff, which is chalk. And eventually the whole of Kent would have been covered in chalk, but most of it's eroded away. And just along the North Downs scarp, the chalk is exposed. Then, since Roman times, we've been grazing sheep and creating these wonderful chalk downlands. The essence of a chalk downland is it's grazed with livestock, it's on chalk, and the soil, as you can see, is very thin and very poor. What that means is that a wide variety of plants are able to flourish, not just 1 or 2 species. This time of year, it's a yellow time of year, and it's not all buttercups by any means. There's rock roses here, the horseshoe vetch there, which is the food plant of the Adonis blue butterfly, and this, when I can find it, lovely yellow hawkweed. Later in the year it turns red and it turns blue as the thyme, the scabious, all the other flowers come into bloom. And because it's so rich in flowers, it's fantastic for butterflies, especially blue butterflies. Clouds of common blues and Adonis blues, which are both flying now. Later in the year in August, clouds of chalk-heel blues as well. So it's a fantastic habitat for butterflies, it's fantastic for wildflowers, and it's kept by traditional grazing with sheep and cattle. It's always an exciting place to come, and in Kent we've got some wonderful nature reserves on the downland, here at Liddon, at Wye, behind Folkestone, and a host of other reserves. One of those other reserves, in this case further west in the county, is Queendown Warren, a Kent Trust reserve just west of Chatham. Again, the thin chalk soil is on a steeply sloping bank, and this is kept short by grazing cattle. Queendown Warren, like Lyddon Down, is popular throughout the year for naturalists and ramblers alike. This sort of West Kent chalk grassland is a favourite habitat for the dark green fritillary, a rare butterfly best seen on the west bank of the Medway around Trosley. Flying in the middle of summer, the shining mother-of-pearl markings on the underwings are really spectacular. Marbled whites, a much more common butterfly of the chalk grassland, are found right the way along the downs, though for some reason with a mysterious distribution gap in central Kent. It should really be called the marbled brown, since it's a member of the brown family. Its black and white wings are a wonderful and typical sight of high summer on the downs. Black and red burnet moths are found throughout the county, usually feeding on scabious or thistles and laying their eggs in grasses. Queendown Warren is home to an extremely rare plant, the meadow clary, and here it's being visited by a bumblebee. Its weight opens the lipped flowers, which allows the bee to crawl inside, push its proboscis down into the nectar, and incidentally cross-pollinate the plant. And although this insect looks like a bee, actually it isn't. It's a moth, a narrow-bordered bee hawk moth, doing much the same, visiting the meadow clary to extract the nectar. Pyramidal orchids are a spectacular sight in June, growing wherever the chalk grassland is short enough. They're often accompanied by fragrant orchids, a much taller and thinner species. In this case, the flowers at the bottom of the spike are finished, while those at the top are still in full flower. There's the typical orchid shape to each floret, with that long, backwards bending spike full of nectar. And the monkey orchid, which grows at the Kentrust Reserve at Parkgate Down, just north of Folkestone, is extremely rare, known only from 3 sites in the whole of Britain, and 2 of those are in Kent. Fancifully, one can make the shape of each little flower look a bit like a monkey, with 2 wavy arms and 2 wavy legs. The man orchid is much more common in West Kent than it is over in the east. Again, a typical orchid shape, and sometimes needing to be protected both from grazing livestock and from overzealous orchid watchers. Bee orchids flower in June and July, wherever the chalk grassland is slightly disturbed. They rely on insects to pollinate them, but attract the insect not by nectar, but by the promise of sex. The male insect is lured into trying to mate with the weirdly shaped bottom lip of the orchid flower. It really is one of the most bizarre stories of the plant world. Rabbits have kept the chalk grassland clear of encroaching scrub ever since they were introduced by the Normans. If it wasn't for them, the turf wouldn't have been kept short enough for butterflies and flowers. Hares browse slightly differently, not grazing so close to the ground, but rather nibbling down the hawthorn or other shrubs. And happily, they're making a comeback, especially in mid-Kent and along the North Kent marshes. The Downs can be a blowy and a chilly place in the spring, but cowslips come early, covering the downland in yellow and contrasting sharply with the purple of the early purple orchids. Anthills are a common feature of chalk grassland simply because they've never been ploughed, and so the anthills have a chance to build up over the centuries. The ants provide convenient food for the green woodpecker, foraging hard to find food for its fledged young. Leaving the downland, ancient green lanes lead down to the fringes of agricultural land. Yellowhammers sing from exposed perches, and along the hedgerows and on the edges of the arable land, butterflies are often plentiful. This orange tip flies in early spring. By the beginning of summer, both small and large skippers feed on the creeping thistles on the edges of the fields, joined here by the larger meadow brown. Ringlets are common too, with those lovely white rings on the underwings. Traditional hay meadows are amongst the scarcest of all agricultural habitats in Kent. It's a real darling buds of May sort of sight. This is Marden Meadow, bang slap in the centre of the Weald and a tiny Kent Trust reserve. But it's packed full of flowers, not just yellow buttercups and yellow rattle, but particularly green-winged orchids, a plant that was common before agricultural improvement started at the end of the last war. Thousands of these orchids flower in May just on this small 2-acre reserve. Visitors come in their hundreds to admire them. Some rather more talented visitors even come to paint them too, capturing their delicate shades in watercolour. Some plants are attractive and some plants are poisonous. This is deadly nightshade, but seemingly not deadly to the bees visiting it for the nectar. Ragwort, too, is a poisonous plant to grazing stock, but clearly not to the orange and black striped cinnabar moth caterpillars, which are making a meal out of it. That orange and black colour is a fairly universal sign in nature saying, "I'm poisonous, keep off, it won't do you any good to eat me," and it's a deterrent to passing birds and other predators. The colour carries through into the adult cinnabar moth, which is that lovely black and red colour, and into this garden tiger moth showing its bright scarlet underwings. Red is for danger. Red perhaps is for danger too with this grazing flock of pedigree Sussex cattle, though truth be told they're a fairly docile breed. They're grazing on Hothfield Common, a Kent Trust reserve close to Ashford, and almost the last relic of heathland left in the whole county. An acid bog is rare indeed in a county which is predominantly chalky and extremely dry, and the cattle do a good job of keeping down the regenerating birch and other scrub, and therefore allowing the heather to flourish. The dark brown bits on this map are the peat bogs themselves. It's a fine open site, and later in the summer the heather will make a colourful show. All the year round it's good for wildlife, and good for walkers too, and much used by local people out for some exercise and some fresh air. The dark heather shows up well against the paler brown grasses that surround it. This wooden causeway over one of the bogs is a good route in to look at the wetland. The acidic water supports a range of plants and insects found nowhere else in the county. This heath-spotted orchid, for instance, is yet to flower and is distinctly rare in Kent. The sundew, with its weird extraterrestrial spiny leaves, traps insects and later digests them. This fallen tree is a memento of the 1987 hurricane, and the small copse of birch that has sprung up around it has been deliberately left to provide a useful habitat, in this case for a foraging wren. The missel thrush is one of the earliest birds to nest, and the adult has a hard time keeping up with the appetite of the growing young. Woodlands are a quite different habitat. This is Yocklett's Bank, a Kent Trust reserve on the edge of a dry chalk valley halfway between Folkestone and Canterbury. 10,000 years ago, the whole of Kent would have been one big primeval forest, but as early as 5,000 years ago, Paleolithic and Neolithic man started to clear the trees for agriculture, and the Romans and medieval people finished the job. These remnants of ancient woodland are the very heartland of Kent's wildlife. It's terrifically rich, not just in plants like lady orchids and celandines and violets, all of which flower before the full leaf canopy comes on the trees, so they make the most of the spring sunlight. But it's terrifically rich in birds, not just the chiff-chaff I can hear behind me, but birds like song thrush, robin, blackbird, our traditional garden birds. Their real heartland is here in the woodlands of Kent. The wren is one of our commonest woodland birds. Fossicking around at the base of bramble bushes and making an extraordinary volume of noise for such a tiny bird. The chiff-chaff has flown all the way across the Sahara to the woodlands of Kent, and its monotonous chiff-chaff, chiff-chiff-chaff, chiff call is a real feature of early spring. Spotted flycatchers are another summer migrant, although sadly a declining one. Tree creepers can be seen at any time of the year, moving in a jerky, mouse-like fashion, always up the bark and very rarely, although it's doing it just here, downwards. They're particularly fond of old trees with flaking bark for nesting and feeding sites. Woodlands are good for mammals too. Grey squirrels aren't a native species to Britain, introduced here from North America in the 1870s, and they've become a regrettably familiar part of the woodland scene. Foxes are really a woodland species too, though they've spread out and are thriving in Kent's towns as well. In early summer, the fox cubs play, learning to fight, to fend for themselves, and gaining essential survival skills. It's at this time of the year that the vixen is hardest pressed to find food to feed her growing brood. Woodlands in winter are quite a different story. Queendown Warren, although mostly chalk downland, has woodland attached to it as well. And walking through the woods in winter, one gets a quite different experience. The catkins are just showing, the very first signs of spring. Carpets of dead leaves underfoot provide not only food for the trees as they rot down, but also a home for hibernating small mammals. And the trees are still bare of leaves, making it relatively easy for the bird watcher. But woodlands aren't immune to their own changing circumstances. On October the 16th, 1987, a hurricane demolished thousands of trees throughout Kent. Much energy was spent in clearing up, but it's enormously encouraging to see how most of the woodlands have resprouted and are regenerating naturally. And the fallen dead timber provides a useful habitat for insects, which in turn feed birds like this coaltit. Woodlands have been managed for their timber for thousands of years, and these volunteers are working with the Kent Trust to duplicate that traditional management. It's hard work, and no conservation organisation could achieve all the management work it does without an army of volunteers. But it's sad to see wood going on a bonfire. Far better to try and use it on site, and here the Trust workers are preparing sweet chestnut in order to use it later on for fencing within the reserve. It's one of the finest fencing timbers of all, introduced by the Romans and still in use now. In order to get sweet chestnut the right size for fencing, it has to be coppiced and cut close to the ground when it's still quite young. This wood is waiting to go to market. And just after it's cut, with spindly regrowth, it looks a fairly dismal sight, hardly a promising home for wildlife.
And the great thing about coppice woodland is that it grows again. Only 18 months ago, this would have been cut down, and whether it's sweet chestnut or birch or the oak over there, it's sprouting again. And that 15-20-year coppice cycle gives the whole range of conditions in which wildlife can really thrive.
The sudden burst of sunlight onto the forest floor, after maybe a 15-year absence, allows an explosion of wild flowers. Greater stitchwort, red campion, and of course, bluebells. They may be a familiar sight to us, but internationally they're a very restricted plant. The bluebell woods of southeast England are one of our real international glories. And herb Paris is a rare plant only found on ancient undisturbed woodland. Wild garlic is another familiar plant of ancient woodlands, recognisable instantly by its strong smell as you walk on it and crush the leaves. Another colourful treasure of Kent, and found nowhere else in Britain, is the elegant lady orchid. It grows in undisturbed ancient woodland, and a fertile imagination could make each floret into a lady with a bonnet, 2 arms, and a flouncy skirt. The common twayblade, growing next to it, is in the same orchid family, though you'd never believe it from looking at its unobtrusive green flower. And the fly orchid, like the bee orchid, imitates an insect to try to persuade it to mate with it.
Woodland rides like this are of course built for timber extraction, that's why it's rutted, but they're terrific for us for access as well. They're great paths to walk along. And of course, because they're open all the year, even when the woodland has grown up, this is still going to get lots of light. That makes it great for wildflowers. There's bugle flowering down here, there's broom flowering as well, and stitchwort, and they're excellent places to look in the high summer for butterflies and moths.
In this case, a large skipper is feeding on bramble, one of the best nectar sources for butterflies. Green hair streaks are early spring butterflies, both of the woodland edges and of chalk grassland. That shining, iridescent colour is typical of the hair streak family, and it's found on this small copper too, with its bright orange and brown wings. One of the most famous of all Kentish butterflies is the heath fritillary, found throughout the Blean woods around Canterbury. The caterpillar feeds only on common cowwheat, and the butterfly is now found on only a few sites in Kent and a couple down in Exmoor. Its wings show a typical fritillary-type netted pattern. The coppiced woodland provides a habitat not just for butterflies and flowers, but for reptiles too. This adder is sunning itself on a recently cut coppice stool, warming itself up, as this lizard is as well, to go off and hunt for food for the day. Some of Kent's best woodlands are at Ham Street, just south of Ashford, right next to another quite distinct habitat on Romney Marsh, bounded to the north by the Royal Military Canal, a historic reminder of naval defences in Napoleonic times.
I have to say that wetlands are not Kent's strongest point. We're a very dry county with only 25 inches of rain a year, and most of our water comes from underground, especially in East Kent, so we've got very little in the way of surface reservoirs. But all the same, rivers such as the Medway and the Stour, which are both phenomenal for wildlife, reservoirs such as Bow Beach over in the west of the county, great reed beds such as Stodmarsh are all good for wildlife. So too is this site, the Royal Military Canal, a long, effectively a linear nature reserve running between Folkestone and Rye. This time of year it's good for dragonflies, for damselflies, for reed and sedge warblers. At any time of the year, it's a brilliant place just to get away from it all and relax.
Away in the distance, the scarp of the old Romney shoreline reminds us that Romney Marsh was once almost completely underwater and was a morass of marshes and reed beds, home of smugglers and home of fantastic wildlife too. Abundant insects hatch out from the surface of the canals and ditches in summer, providing food for swooping swallows, building up their strength for the long migration south to Africa. Dragonflies and damselflies like this still water. Emperor dragonflies lay their eggs just underneath the surface. Both damselflies and dragonflies fly around in weird tandem positions, ready to mate at the slightest moment's notice. Concentrations of paired blue damselflies sit on the lily pads, looking like something out of a science fiction film. The compound eyes of the dragonfly are peculiarly sensitive to the slightest movement. Predictably, amphibians like these wet conditions too. In May and June, the noise of the marsh frog resounds right the way through Romney Marsh. Introduced in the 1920s, they're now flourishing. Marsh frogs make their loud chuckling noise by inflating air sacs at the sides of their mouths. They're really a Mediterranean species, but like all amphibians, they provide food for herons. Stalking patiently, herons will eat almost anything, small rodents, worms, large insects, as well as fish and amphibians. And the abundant insects provide food for this young pied wagtail as well, old enough to feed itself, but not quite old enough to be completely independent of its parent. At the sides of the canals and ponds, coots sit demurely on their nests, easily recognized by that white blazon on the front of their forehead. Larger water bodies in Kent are less common, but this one at Stodmarsh National Nature Reserve is quite exceptional. The open water provides home for great-crested grebes, now happily relatively common, although at the turn of the century they were almost extinct, hunted for their plumage, which was used in women's hats. The female has the endearing habit of carrying the black and white striped young on her back, where they're fed by the male. Stodmarsh is in the Stour Valley between Canterbury and Sandwich, but actually the whole of the River Stour is a brilliant place for wildlife. It's a varied landscape, the hills of the Stour Valley on either side running down to a low valley bottom, with a combination of arable fields, grazing pasture, woodland, and open water. This is the largest reed bed in Kent, an important habitat for many birds, bitterns in the winter, hunting marsh harriers in the summer, and particularly for reed and sedge warblers, migratory species which winter south of the Sahara. The sedge warbler sings its scratchy song from prominent reed stems, and it's easily identified by its pale stripe above the eye. The bearded tit isn't really a tit at all, but a member of a tropical family called the parrotbills, and it both breeds and winters here at Stodmarsh. They're real reed specialists, feeding on insects in the summer and almost exclusively on fallen reed seeds in the winter. And of course, another passing heron. Wherever there is water in Kent, you'll find herons. Although at Stodmarsh the Stour flows slowly, higher up above Canterbury, it's a faster flowing river with many mills like this one at Chilham along it. Again, herons lurk on the riverbanks, in this case preening to make sure its plumage is in tip-top condition. That's essential for any bird, but especially one associated with water. The fast-flowing water provides enough oxygen to support trout and caddisflies, and even birds like this grey wagtail, not normally associated with a county as dry as Kent. Down at Dungeness, there's a quite different watery landscape. In this case, the biggest shingle spit in Europe. The seabirds here are feeding on the warm outflow water from the nuclear power station, and they're after fish in just the same way as the fishermen are on the beach. Happily, it's still used for commercial fishing as well, with an active fleet of small boats. Dungeness is one of the first landfalls for migrating birds, in this case a swift. If you're really lucky, you might glimpse a hobby, a migrant falcon a bit like a small version of the peregrine. They're acrobatic flyers catching their prey, small birds, in this case insects, on the wing, in an extraordinary display of agile and skillful flying. The shingle at Dungeness isn't just good for migrating birds, it's good for flowers as well. In early summer, the white of the sea beet and the red of the valerian make a fine colour combination. And the shingle supports other colourful plants too. Bird's-foot trefoil, normally a grassland plant but growing just as well here on the shingle. Yellow-horned poppy is a real shingle specialist. And bladder campion is another plant rarely found far from the sea. And broom, normally a tall shrub, but here so battered by the sea winds that it's only a few inches high, but still with large, colourful flowers. The pink and white of stonecrop grows amongst it. It's not only birds that migrate, insects do as well. Every plant of this sea beet is a welcome break for a passing migrant, in this case a painted lady butterfly. An immigrant from North Africa and the continent that sometimes arrives, as it did in 1996, in huge numbers. Dungeness, poking out into the channel, is its first port of call and gives it a chance to refuel on nectar from the sea beet. And butterflies aren't the only insect migrants. Moths do it as well. These are silver Y moths, coming over in vast numbers from the continent and building up their energy on this red valerian. This abundant moth species is found in summer in gardens all over Britain. As one would expect, Dungeness has been much exploited for its gravel. But the pits which are left behind are good for wildlife. Gulls nest on the islands, safe from any predators. And the gravel banks on the edges provide a rich feeding ground for a variety of birds. Black-headed gulls nest noisily on their crowded island. Whilst waders feed in the margins trying to catch fish, and sometimes losing them. Turnstones have a good wash on the edge of the water. A young common tern flies in to be fed. And oyster catchers patrol with their bills wide, looking for all the world like two elderly and thoughtful Oxford philosophers. Black-headed gulls build their nests often in large numbers. The bigger the colony, the safer they are. Common terns use the same safety in numbers technique. Common terns feed mostly on sand eels and sprats, which they catch out at sea and then bring the half-mile inland to their nests. Migrating waders stalk along the edges of the water, searching for insects. Waders like this ruff breed very rarely in Britain, passing through to their breeding grounds in Arctic Russia. The male gets its name from the extraordinary ruff of feathers around its neck, which it uses to display to the females. Like a hairstyle, it's more manageable head on to the wind. Common sandpipers are always active, and always bob their tail up and down as they dart along the water's edge. Redshank preen themselves, and in the background, a turnstone lives up to its name, economically flipping over each stone it finds in the hope of finding food beneath. On the shingle itself, some birds rely on camouflage as they nest. This ring plover is trying very hard to be a variegated stone, with a good deal of success. Threats to the ring plover come from crows, from gulls, and from other ring plovers. The full threat display involves puffing out the neck and fanning out the tail feathers to make the bird look bigger and to see off the intruder. success, celebrated by a quick preen. Oyster catchers nest in the shingle as well, stalking cautiously towards their nest before settling down to brood the eggs. Little terns are also specialist shingle breeders and are very rare, with only a handful of pairs successfully breeding in Kent every year. Their delicate way of swooping down on fish, as with all terns, has earned them their nickname of sea swallows. As the tide rises, platoons of oyster catchers fly past from their feeding grounds to their roosts on the shingle. The water in Kent isn't just around the coast. 1 or 2 inland reservoirs also provide a good wildlife habitat. Here at Bow Beach, a Kent Trust reserve run with the East Surrey Water Company, a convenient causeway provides a good place for birdwatchers to scan the water and the Oast-house has been converted into an interpretation and education centre run by the Kent Trust. Winter is the best time to see spectacular numbers of duck and other wildfowl at Bow Beach. Great-crested grebes, cormorants and passing sandpipers can be seen at any time of the year. Sanderling, active little waders darting around the water's edge, only visit in autumn and spring on migration. And little ringed plovers are summer visitors, rarely breeding in Britain, but sometimes succeeding at Bow Beach in rearing a few young. For the visitor to Kent, there are hundreds of footpaths and ancient trackways to explore. This is the Pilgrim's Way on the North Downs near Maidstone. Affectionately titled the Garden of England, Kent's hop gardens are a reminder of our regional and traditional farming heritage. Sadly, an increasing thirst for lager and wine has greatly reduced the hop industry. The North Kent marshes are different again. There are great sweeps of historic landscape, expanses of mudflats, and a constant backdrop of industry, whether it's pylons, or power stations, or great ports. Brent geese are a familiar sight in winter on the marshes. Coming to Kent in their thousands from their Siberian breeding grounds, they feed on grasses in the estuaries and on the surrounding arable fields, to the delight of birdwatchers and the fury of farmers, calling and chuckling their way in constant skeins across the sky.
Well, those Brent geese out there don't look as cold as I feel. It's winter now, and although the bluebells and the nightingales are just a passing memory, this is one of the real bonuses of Kent. It's the North Kent marshes at Lower Halstow, and they stretch all the way from the Medway, the Swale, right through the Thames estuary, and it's an absolute mecca for wintering wildfowl. That's geese and ducks and waders. And when the tide goes down, as it is at the moment, then All these mudflats out here are just one big feeding station, and there's Brent geese, there's pintail, there's redshank, there's dunlin, and they're right next to us here at the seawall. They're very easy to watch, and they're wonderful.
All the birds out here have subtly specialised feeding strategies. Shelduck, with their short bills, sieve the very surface of the mud looking for small insects and crustaceans. Curlews, with their longer bills, probe down 6 inches or more below the surface. Ringed plovers dart actively over the surface of the mud, picking off whatever they can find. And little stints forage busily on the edge with their shorter bills, with always the backdrop of the Brent geese. Redshank breed here in Kent, but winter in larger numbers, picking their way delicately and gracefully over the mud at the water's edge. And grey plovers winter here in internationally important numbers. And of course, the inevitable heron. But it's not just waders that use the North Kent marshes. Duck are here in their thousands. Widgeon, shoveler and gadwall join the resident black-headed gulls, feeding and bathing in the shallow waters. Black-tailed godwits are a relatively common sight in winter and on migration, but happily a few pairs stay on every year to breed. And dunlin don't breed here at all, but use the marshes as a wintering ground and a migration stopover. Ducks have different ways of feeding. Some dive, these pintail upend. The male is one of the most graceful of all ducks, with his long pointed tail and his chocolate and white head. Pintail numbers on the marshes are now rising, thanks to some careful habitat management. As the tide rises, so it becomes urgent that waders find a place to roost. This needs to be safe, surrounded by water but not covered by it, and with a clear field of view. And thousands of birds can huddle together just on one small spit. The dunlin here are looked after by one motherly grey plover. It's not just on the water that the North Kent marshes are good for wildlife. The traditional grazing fields are rich in mice and voles, and that in turn provides food for short-eared owls which winter here. This one is hunting over the RSPB reserve at Elmley on the Isle of Sheppey. Like huge moths, they fly by day, unusual for owls, and this makes them obligingly easy to watch.
Well, I was hoping for a nightingale to finish with, but all we've got is a very noisy wren, a song thrush and a robin somewhere in the background, but that's the way it goes. It's been incredibly difficult to fit the quite astonishing variety of Kent's landscape and wildlife, and I have to say weather, hot today and gosh it was cold in the North Kent marshes in February, into one short video. But I do hope it's managed to communicate to you the excitement and the interest that's out here in the countryside of Kent, waiting to be discovered as you go exploring. And whether you're a visitor to the county or whether you're a resident, then the best way to experience wildlife is to be right here, out, enjoying it. And I do hope that this video will help you to do just that. Oops. And there you are, right on cue. There's your nightingale.